Hey everyone, in a previous video I created this guestbook page and I started to talk about the basics of JavaScript, but there were some things that I forgot to go over, and that's conditional logic. So, if statements and switch statements, and also repeating, let's say, logic. So things like a for loop, a do loop, while loop, things that are going to loop or repeat. And I think as well I'm going to touch on some ES6 features, such as arrow functions, constants, and let variables. And maybe also touch on something called strict mode. So I think I'd rather go through some of these before actually making the backend for the guestbook. So I'm going to start by creating a new script for that called conditionals.js, and then update the package JSON for that. Alright, and now if I run npm start, it should be running our script, and then I can show you some conditional logic. So right now, this always prints out, but we'd want it to only print out for a certain condition. And this is going to be something that's true or false. So let's just make it true for now. And we can do that using a if statement. So if this condition is true, then it's going to execute whatever's in this block of code. And of course, if I run it now, it's just going to always log out that message. So we could have some other, fancy logic here, but eventually it's going to be something that evaluates to something that's true, and then it will run this. But one thing as well that might be confusing is this will also evaluate to true. So if I provide the condition as a string, it's evaluated as true. And this comes down to how JavaScript evaluates expressions. So this expression here is evaluated to true because it's got a value. It's got a defined value. And this is then going to be a concept that I will introduce called defined and undefined. So let's do some other condition, but don't set it to a value. If I try that one, what do you think will be the result? Well, we see that it doesn't actually print out the value. And that's because if a variable is not provided a value, it's the same as saying that it's undefined. And this will evaluate to false. So undefined will evaluate to false. There are other conditions that will evaluate to false. We saw previously that a number, 0, when we used it with an operator, with a string, it might do some type conversion or coercion. So it's basically a similar thing here. This will be coerced or converted into a Boolean. So 0 is kind of equivalent to false. And so that also won't run. If we gave it a value of 1, we expect it to print out. and it does. Well, what happens if we give it any kind of other number? If we give it 22, it evaluates to true and it prints out as well. Let's give it a negative number, maybe -1. Looks like my terminal is broken, so let me just open it again. So that also evaluates to true, because it's anything that's not 0, a non-zero number, will basically be converted into a value of true. We call it truthy. It's not really false, it's not really true, but it's evaluated to true. So that's kind of a concept in JavaScript known as truthiness and falsiness. So I think I'll put that over here as booleans, truthiness, falsiness, where it's not really true, but evaluated to true or false. I think I'll move that closer to the data type section, because undefined is actually kind of like a data type. So if I go back to variables, let me try introduce then at the bottom here, var value. Let's see what I get for that. If I say npm run variables, it seems like it didn't shadow the number in this case. So I'm just going to try and set it to a specific variable, because I think that's what it's, yeah, that's fine. And let's remove the toString. All right. So we see that when I explicitly set it to undefined, it gets the type of undefined. So it's a specific type. There's also another kind of value that I can set to something that doesn't have a value, and that's null. So let's see what happens in that case. It should be quite obvious. It doesn't print out, so it's also evaluated to false. And let's see again with the variables. In this case, it's an object, which is a bit interesting. So null is just a specific kind of object, and when we compare to null, we're comparing to that that value. That's a little bit confusing perhaps, but it's kind of like the null object pattern, I suppose, in a way. I'm not really sure if that's the case, but it's just something to bear in mind. So even though it is actually defined as an object, it's a defined value. So let's try this one. If I set it to an object, it does actually evaluate to true. And even though null is an object, specifically for that case, it evaluates to false. So that's just something to keep in mind. So we have undefined and null. And then for numbers, there's also one called not any number. which is a special value. And we see that it's a type of number. So let me just go back to the variables and add that one. And see what it prints out when we run the variables demo. We see it is a number, but it's a special kind of number to say, well, we can't really determine what the value is representing. So generally that happens when you get some kind of multiplication or division or some kind of operation where there might be an overflow of the data. It's too big to store in the data type, and then the result is not any number. Or for example, if we divide by 0 in maths, that's not really defined. If we say 1 divided by 0, we get infinity in this case. Let's say a big number times another big number. Well, in this case, it actually seems to work. So what would the case be? Let's try, say, a string divided by 0. Maybe we try divided by 1. There we go. So that's actually the case. So in this case, we tried to do integer division, but we couldn't figure out what this number would be. And so we got not any number. So I'll just add that as a specific example. And then I suppose infinity is also a specific case where we divide by 0. All right, so we see there's some special values for the different types, and they can be evaluated to true or false. So let's see what happens actually if we say infinity. What do you think that will print out? If I run the right demo. Well, that does print out something because infinity is evaluated to true. It is a number. Not any number does not have a number, so it's evaluated to false. All right, so those are some quirks, I think, in JavaScript. A lot of times you might see an if condition where you are trying to get the truthiness or falsiness of a random data type. But because we know that this is a specific data type, maybe this is a number, for example, and it's going to evaluate to a Boolean number, we can kind of force this to be a Boolean value by doing a trick where we say not. So we negate the value of the data, and then we negate it again. So it's kind of the same as doing this. We know infinity will evaluate to true, but it's a number type. If we negate it, then it's going to be false. It's going to evaluate to a specific Boolean type. If we negate it again, then we get the actual value we wanted, which is true, and it's a Boolean type. So that's a common trick that we'll see, and that's, let's say, more explicit. So let's say forcing a Boolean data type, e.g. infinity. So here we have, let's say, infinity, and we say not. And let's see what that prints out. And we see we get a type of Boolean. It evaluates to true because it evaluated to true, then we negated it, so we got false, and then we negated again to get back the truth value. So often we see this happening. So if we want the opposite, then obviously we just need the single negation. And again, if we just run the example, we see that that's exactly how we can get true or false. If we know that this will be evaluated to true, and we really just want the true value, we can use this double negation. Otherwise, we can use a single negation. And this exclamation mark is an operator, but it's only working on one value. So we saw in the past that we had x plus y. That would be an operator on two different values. So you'd need this part, the left part, and the right part. But with the exclamation mark, it only needs one value. So you only have, one side to care about. And they call this a unary operator because it takes one parameter. And they call this one, I guess, binary operator. But this could be confusing because binary is, also a data type. So I think in general that is called it an operator because it has two operands. I'll say two parameters / operands, and here one parameter or operand. Okay, so let me just add that to the README because I also went through, I suppose, operators. Let's put it here. So we have normal operators and we have unary operators. Okay, and we've seen undefined, null, not a number, and we've seen infinity. Okay, so an if statement also has an else branch, so you can say else. So, if you want to have something run when it's true, but also run when it's false. So this always prints out when true. If I change that to false, this always prints out when false. And you can have multiple of these branches using an else if. But when you have an else if, you also need another condition. Alright, so this will only print out when they're both evaluated true. And you see this one was false, but then this one evaluated to true, and that's why this one ran. If I make this evaluate to false, then we should see the last else block being run, which we do. Alright, so that's basically an important conditional operator that let's say, keyword that you would need, this if statement, I suppose it is. It's a statement. Another one is a switch. So let's say we got in some input. Maybe there was a choice that someone entered, and they entered a choice of menu option 1. But let's say you could have multiple options. So maybe you would have a case where it would be menu option 1, or it could be, menu option 2, menu option 3, menu option 4. Or maybe you don't know exactly what case you would have, so you have maybe a default case as well. And then in each case, maybe we wanted to just log out what was selected. So I can just do that like this. This is what they call a switch statement, but each of these cases and the default case, we would want to break out of them to make sure that only this code is run in that case. If you don't say break, then it will just carry on running whatever it sees. It'll, if this one still applies, then it will run this as well. So it's generally best to just add a break statement to every single case, especially with the default one here. It might run both of these statements, for example, if you don't have that. So we know it's going to be option 1, so we expect it to say that option 1 was selected. Let's say npm start. That's exactly what we get. Let's say I put in option 3. That's also what we get. And let's say I put in an option that I haven't really handled yet. Then I get the default being selected. And of course, yeah, you can have multiple lines as well. So you could do whatever you want in here, but it's generally a bad idea to have too much logic in a switch statement. But that's basically a switch statement. Let me show you the example here. Let's say I put menu option 4. You would maybe expect only this one to be entered. But we see it does both this one and the default case. And that's because we didn't break out of it. Let's see what happens when we do menu option 3. The same thing. So it starts, it enters here, and then it's just going to carry on and carry on. So what you need to do is you need to enter a break statement for each case to avoid that runoff. Okay, so that's basically conditional logic. And then looping. So let's say we wanted to ask the user for a choice, but then if we don't get an actual choice, we want to ask them for the choice again. I'm going to actually try this in the browser. So let me create a file here. And I'm just going to add a script for the conditionals file. And I'm going to try and host this then in my web server. Now there's two ways of doing this. You could just use IIS. Well, there's multiple ways of doing it. You could use IIS or any web server you want. I've already shown you IIS, but there's another package which I find quite useful, and it's called HTTP server package, and you can run it without having to install it into your project. You can say npx HTTP server, and you can say a path that you want it to host from. So I just want to host it at this directory. npx is going to try and install the package. I already have it installed. And so then it'll run your server. And I'm just going to open up the local host. And then if I open up my developer console, you can see it's doing what I was expecting it to do earlier. But I'm going to change it here to say prompt. Please enter a choice. 1 to 4. Right, and then if I refresh, the browser has a built-in function called prompt, which shows me this window. And then if I press, or if I enter any text, I press OK. You see the default was selected, and that's because the value of choice was actually not menu option 1, it was just the string 1. So I can show that by adding this code. So we see the default was selected, the value was 1. So maybe what I do is I can say it should be menu option and then the number. All right, and then that now works like I expected it to work before. Or of course I could change this. I could say this should be, instead of menu option 1, I could just say 1. And that works. And you see it's the string 1, but I can also use different data types here. So I could maybe put in numbers here. And let's see what happens now. Now it works. If I try to put 3, it works. So the value of choice is actually a number. Let me try and, well, it's actually not a number. We see it's actually a string, but the value that gets used in the switch here is kind of coerced. If it can be coerced to this case, then it will run that case. And let me try actually add the string case here as well. I'll say 1 was selected string, 1 was selected number. If I refresh and I put in 1, we see 1 was selected with string is the one that gets matched because this is the most relevant one. If I put this maybe below in the order, let's see what happens. It still gets that one because that's the one that matches the most. But let's say I try and convert this to a number. So we saw previously that if I say 0 plus a string, it should use number addition when that string is a number. So I'll try, say, converted choice instead of choice. Refresh. And actually, it isn't getting what I thought it would get, because my assumption was wrong. It doesn't coerce this into a number. It uses string concatenation. So this is a common bug that we all see with JavaScript, and I'm going to show you a really quick hack. I think this will work. That one does work. And now why does that work? Well, that's because this operator is a unary operator. It's actually a different kind of operator to this one. This one works on two numbers. This one only works on one operand. So it kind of converts a string to a number. So that's a common technique. And let's just see then that I'm not lying to you. Let's try and say force a string data type. Example 1 to number. Let's say forcing a number data type from a string. So if the value is going to be 19, but I say plus 19, then what do I get when I run my variables example? There we go, we get a type number. So this operand or operator, let's look in the Mozilla Developer Network. We see this addition. And actually, I'm looking for another operator. Here it is, I think, unary plus. So the unary plus operator precedes its operand and evaluates to its operand, but attempts to convert it to a number if it isn't already. And there we go. So that's exactly why that's working. It's a bit of a interesting gotcha in JavaScript, but nice to know. So we actually don't need this. We can just say plus choice. And if I now run my script again, we see that we should have the same result. So one was selected, but this case was the number case. So it's quite important to be wary of what data types you're using in these switch, well, I guess in expressions in general, to see what they're going to be evaluated to. So it's always good to kind of be more explicit about what data type you're expecting and do some kind of tricks to convert it to make sure it's really in the data type you're expecting. So because we're expecting numbers, I'm just going to take away the string case. And now let's try and add that logic. So in the default case, I want to repeat this block basically. So I have a variable and I want to just keep prompting for someone until I get a choice that I'm expecting. So I'm going to say do, and I'll say while condition. And I'm just going to put this all in that block. All right, and then I'm just going to loop this until the converted choice. I'm going to say the type of converted choice is a number, and converted choice is less than or equal to 4, and converted choice is greater than or equal to 1. So let me try that. If I enter 5, well, it says the default was selected 5. Let me just refresh to make sure I didn't, well, it's not working. So let's see, why isn't it working? Let's go into the sources here, and I can go to my file, and I can put a breakpoint here, and I can put a breakpoint here. And let's try and just refresh and debug this script. So in the sources tab, there's this debugging experience where you can add some breakpoints. And when I run the script, it's going to break at that breakpoint and then allow me to like see what's happening. So here I can see choice is not defined yet, converted choice is not defined yet. On the right here, there's some buttons to step over the function call, to step into the function, but this is a built-in function, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to step over it. And see, once I step over it, it runs that code, and then it asks me for a choice. So I'm going to press 5, press OK. So we see the choice that was entered was 5. And I'm going to then step over again. Converted choice is the number 5. So it should hit here. And then I'm just going to keep stepping. So it's doing what we expect. And now it gets to here. And we see type of converted choice. I've actually got my logic wrong, it looks like. So I've got the inverse of my logic. If I look here, I've looped until it's less than 4, but actually that's what I wanted to do. I want it to be less than 4. So I've got my logic incorrect there. So that's a nice way to see why your script's not working, using these debugging tools in the developer tools. Again, you can get to it from More Tools, Developer Tools. You can press Ctrl-Shift-I, or in some browsers you can press F12. And then you can add your breakpoints under the source tab, and you can also see things like how the variables are defined and that kind of stuff on the side here. Okay, so I then also added debugging features of the browser. So we'll see briefly how to add breakpoints, step over functions, inspect variables, values at runtime. And then that helps us to figure out there's an issue in our code. So actually we want to do this when it's the opposite case. So it's going to be the opposite of this. And that actually should be fine. Let me just run that script again. And you see now it's doing what I expect. So now it's looping until I get a proper value. If I refresh again, if I press cancel, I get null. If I put in some text, I get not any number. And if I put in, let's say 1.4, I do get a value, but it gets me the default. So that's a bit of a bug as well, but I'm going to move on from that because I'm basically trying to explain how we can loop through things. So let's say with this value, we want to then print out something that many times. So we can use a for loop to iterate over some values. So I could say I'm going to start my iterator at 1, and then I'm going to say it should run a certain piece of code each time it iterates. So I'm going to say iterator is equal to iterator plus 1. And then it should iterate every time based on some condition. So I'm going to say that the iterator should be less than converted choice. And now let's say iteration number iterator. If I reload my script, let's put in 3, and we see I have a bug. Let me close the tab because it's going to crash. I've actually gotten this the wrong way around. So it should be the condition second and then the operation that happens each iteration third. And yeah, we see I've got a bug here. It's kind of going into an infinite loop. So I can open my task manager in Chrome if it works. It seems that Chrome is even struggling here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Windows PowerShell, and I'm just going to say PS Chrome, and then I'm going to pipe that into the kill command. And what that does is basically it finds the process Chrome. These are the different processes running on my operating system named Chrome, and then I just pass it through a utility to close the process, to kill it from running. And actually in PowerShell it's called get process, but there's an alias that says PS for get process. And similarly for kill, it's called stop process. So I could have said get process Chrome pipe stop process, and that would have done the same. Okay, in this case it can't find the Chrome process, so that's why we get that error. But that's a useful tip as well when things are not working the way you expect it to, I suppose. So let's just run that again. It was on localhost 8080, I think. Yes. And let's try now. Now it works. Okay, it kind of works. It works differently to what I was expecting. Let's just start from 0. Or let's make it less than or equal to. So it should do 3 times, and it prints it out 3 times. If I print it out 4 times, if I press escape, it doesn't do anything. If I press 1.4, it just does it once. If I do 1.8, it also just does it once. So I guess it's a bit buggy because it's not really choosing an integer, but it works. Okay, and then iterator equals iterator plus 1. You can simplify that to just be iterator plus plus. It's equivalent, it's the same. And a lot of times in programming we count from 0, so we don't need to do less than equals, we can just do less than. Now that should still work. Obviously now it's when I'm printing it out, it's using from 0. So when I do that, I would need to add 1 to the iterator value. All right. And a lot of times we just make iterator be I because it's quite well known that that's what it means. So for I equals 0, I is less than some limit, and then we just increment that counter each time. Sometimes it's called counter, but yeah, as long as it's understandable what you mean, it doesn't really matter. So again, let me just break this up into maybe 3 different lines. This for statement, what it does is it has a piece where you can initialize some kind of variable. Then every time the loop is going to run, it's going to check this condition. If it's true, then it's going to run. And when it's finished running, it's going to then run this code to increment this counter, basically. That allows you to then break out of the loop. Let me add a case here to say case 100. And let me add another condition here to say, or converted choice equals 100. And let me say I wanted to actually break out of this if counter gets to 20. I want to break out of it because you know, we don't want to go all the way past 20. If I run that code and I enter 100, it looks like I've got a bug again in my conditions. So 100 was selected, but the default was done, which is surprising for me. Because I didn't break. So let me just do that. So 100 was selected. I need to actually refresh. I'm going to just close Chrome because it got itself into a loop there. And let me add a breakpoint. Or let me just enter 1 so I can get out of the loop. And add a breakpoint. So most likely we know there's a bug here because it keeps looping. All right, so converted choice. We loop while it's 100. I want it to be not equal to 100. Again, that's my mistake. So let me, now that I fixed that bug, relaunch, enter 100, and now we still have a bug. Let me just make sure I've not got anything cached. I think I actually need to put this inside of the condition here. Let's simplify this logic. So there's a rule called De Morgan's law, where you can, if you see a not, you can basically flip everything and use an or. So I'm going to say it should be or. So it should loop while converted choice is not a number, or converted choice is less than 4, and that should actually be greater than 4, or converted choice is less than or equal to 1, or converted choice is not 100. Let's try that logic. I'm going to close Chrome, put in 100, put in 1, and it seems I got my logic completely wrong. So I'm actually just going to turn off this loop for now, because I'm really only interested in showing you a for loop for now. So I'm going to enter 100, and it's definitely caching something because it shouldn't be looping. I've saved this, and let me just make sure I have my developer tools open. I'm going to disable my cache and then go to localhost. If I enter 100, all right, that's what I was expecting. So I say 100, it goes to 20, well 21 actually, and then we don't want to go past 20, so I'm actually going to make this 19 because we start from 0. And that's exactly what I expected. So that's a way of breaking out of for loops. We've seen do while loops, and I must have gotten my condition wrong. Let's just change the condition to say do while type of converted choice is not equal to number. So if I refresh now and I press cancel, the default or selected is null. And I think it's definitely meant to be looping, because type of null plus null is a number. Okay. Try it one more time, back to 0. I get an infinite loop. So I'm going to say here if counter let's say converted choice equals 0 or okay, well that's a lot of back and forth we're doing now, which can sometimes show the frustrations of development. And actually now I'm not even sure why it's giving me this. So let me do this again. One thing you can do when debugging is you can say debugger. So maybe we don't have time to open the dev tools and add a breakpoint. We just wanted to hit a breakpoint when we hit that line of code. And you see it doesn't actually hit my debugger statement. So I'm going to actually put that in here. And I now see my problem. I've put the do around the wrong place. But just to show you the debugger statement, I'm gonna once again open up the console before I enter a value. We see I didn't have a breakpoint here, but Chrome is paused in the debugger. So that's another useful thing for debugging your script. If I press resume, I'm going to enter 100. We see it hits this debugger statement. If I resume, it's now in the loop again. So let me just step over and see what is going on. So converted choice is 100. It should loop while converted choice is not equal to 100. Type of converted choice is a number. I want to invert this actually. Because these are separate, so I need to invert the one condition. So let me just invert that one. I should only loop if we haven't entered 100 and it's invalid choice. So that's what I meant by inverting. If I refresh now, I'm just going to resume, press escape. It doesn't have my latest script yet, so I'm just going to empty cache and hard reload. If I enter 100, it has my latest version, and now it breaks out the loop. Okay, and we see we then also go into this, and it should hit it until we get to 20, and then it breaks. Because counter was actually 19, it printed out 20, then it got to 20, console logged this, and then exited the loop. So we could also do it here actually. We could say if converted choice equals 100, we could break. We could take this out, and we could even take this part out. And that should also work. So if I say 100, it breaks out, and my loop here is gonna work. I can deactivate breakpoints and I can just resume, so it doesn't hit my debugger. And all right, so now it's working now as I was expecting, and maybe this is a bit simpler logic. So I'm gonna leave it that way. Let me take out these debugger statements. So whenever I come back to it, it doesn't have to hit my breakpoints every time. And let's just recap. So we have a do statement, which will execute whatever's in the block while this condition is true, while it evaluates to true. And you can also break out of it if you want to explicitly break out of it using the break statement. This switch statement also has a break, but it's only for switching, for breaking out of the switch. It doesn't break out of the do loop. The for statement does something similar. It will repeat this block of code, but only while this condition is true, and it also allows us to run some code to initialize variables before. Basically, this code will run before the loop, and this will run after the loop. And then we terminate each one using these semicolons. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too confusing with all of the back and forth debugging. I'm sure it will come naturally. We don't really use a lot of these do loops. Well, I don't. For loops maybe, but there's also other ways to achieve the same thing with these statements. Switch statements might be useful, but there's also other ways of implementing this. You could have a map, for example, especially if these cases get too big, it might become a code smell. But anyway, point being, we've gone through conditional logic and repeating logic. We've gone through some things like what's defined, what's undefined, truthiness and falsiness. So how things are evaluated to true and false, which can be then used as well in those, conditional and repeating loops. I'm also going to show a while loop because that's basically the same as a do while loop. But we start with the while. So while this is true, it'll execute something here. So while counter is greater than 0, we're going to console log out counting down, and we'll say counter minus minus, which is the same as counter equals counter minus 1. So we saw it with plus plus, it's the same with minus minus. All right, and then let's see what happens when I run that. I'm going to say 100. And we see it started counting from 20 and then went down to 1. And we saw we didn't have to actually declare this counter variable, which is strange because it was actually declared here within this for loop. And we'll get into that just now, but basically the while loop is the same as a do loop, but you have the condition first. So first the condition is checked, and then it's going to do whatever's inside of that block. Once it's finished, it comes back and checks the condition. So they're kind of equivalent, but one you test the condition afterwards, one you test the condition before. And usually this one is favored over this variant, at least in my preference. So I've looked at for, do, while, if switch. I'm going to now talk about constants and let variables, because this kind of comes into let's say scoping. So scoping in general is a concept in most programming languages where something is defined for a scope of the program execution. So we saw here that this variable was actually defined on line 39 inside this for loop, but the variable was still accessible here on line 50. So it was 20. We broke out of the for loop, and then here the counter was still defined and accessible. In a lot of programming languages that wouldn't be the case. This variable would only be in scope for the for block, whereas in JavaScript that's different. So a lot of times people would prefer to actually write it like this, because this is kind of how it let's say is evaluated in JavaScript. This variable will be defined in the current executing scope, and then this for loop will just initialize it and then modify it on each iteration. And then because it's still accessible here, the while loop will then have access to it. I'm going to add another file here called scoping.js. And I'll copy this example. I'll just set this equal to 100. And let me just move this into one line, because that's kind of how it normally is. And let me just put this actually into a function. So let me call this run. Let's call it run. And then I'll run the function. And let me change the page here to be scoping.js. If I refresh, it seems I've got a bug. So let me just say var converted choice equals 100. Okay, so that's kind of what we had before. If I try log here counter or converted choice, what do you expect it will do? Well, we see that there's a reference error. Counter is not defined. So we had an error at this line, on line 20. Counter is not defined. But we did define it here on line 3. But the thing is, that was defined in the scope of this function run. So it's not actually in the scope of my script. So I would have to define the variable again here, counter. If I refresh, we see the same thing with converted choice. So I can make this, let's say 200 and 200. Okay. And so this is basically around scoping. So this function block, anything that we define within the function is scoped only to that function. And you'll see, like in the script, we then had to redefine these variables, counter and converted choice. I'm going to create another file called scoping2.js. And I'm going to include it afterwards. Okay, and I'm going to move this console.log into this file. Actually, let me keep it here and say this is from scoping. And then scoping2, I'm just going to add that as a prefix. Okay, and I've referenced it afterwards, so let me just see. What do you expect I'm going to see now? Will we still get an error? Well, we see we don't get an error. And that's because what happens here is if we don't have a function and we're just running it, it's going to run in the current, let's say, execution context. And the execution context of the script is this window, is this document. So if I go into the console here and I say window dot counter, we see that it was defined on the window because we executing it in the JavaScript browsers or in the internet browsers window. Now that can be a problem. For example, if you have two different scripts that you're pulling in, maybe it wasn't locally on my website. Maybe I'm pulling in a script from some other website, and they've defined their own function run and their own, counter variables. So in fact, let's go here and let's move this run to a third one called scoping main.js. Right, if I do that, it should still work. If I refresh, it still runs my run function. Just let me make sure I saved everything. Okay, it still works. But if in scoping 2, I said function run, and I refresh, we see that we've redefined what run is. And that's because initially this function was being defined as a property on the window. And then here we redefine that property run, and we can even do it again here. We could say function run. And if I run it, we see it's been redefined a third time. So that can be a problem if you have multiple scripts all using the same names for things. They could override each other. But we know that if you define something in a function, it's only scoped to that function. So one thing that people have done is to use a function to just wrap all of this. So let's say function initialize. And then we just run initialize. Okay, and then we don't redefine the function on the window, which is quite nice. But how do we actually get to execute this function? Well, we could pass window into it, maybe. And we could say if window.run, evaluates to true, so if it is defined, then we're going to say window.secondRun equals run. Otherwise, we'll just set it to run. And we can initialize. Okay, now if we call second run, we see it's what we expected. Or maybe we want a custom name. Maybe we want to pass a parameter as second run. We could say, function name. And then we could say function name is equal to run. Cool, so then we can customize it. So we could say custom run if we wanted to. If I say window.custom run, that works. Or maybe you had multiple scripts and one of them defined custom run, so you then would have to do the check again. Maybe in this case you would say that if a function name is provided, we don't want it to already be defined on Windows. So we could say if window function name is defined, then we want to throw in an error to say window dot is already defined. Okay. So second run, custom run works. But let's say we wanted to name it alert for some reason. If I refresh, we see we got an error up here to say window.alert is already defined. And so we couldn't actually initialize that other function. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. And then, sometimes we don't really need to have this function here. So there's something called an immediately executing function. So here we want to immediately execute this, passing in these parameters. So this is kind of the same thing. We see we still get that error if I have this as custom run. We don't get an error. And we can say custom run. Okay, so this is known as an immediately invoked function expression, and you can make it an anonymous function if you want. So let me just add that as well to the README. It's called an iffy, immediately invoked function expression. So that would be something like function window. So this is one way of kind of just protecting the scope that you have. You wrap it in a function that's executed immediately. You pass in the kind of global scope called window, and maybe even in your function you could call it global scope. And then you can take whatever other parameters you need, do some validation, and then at the end of it make sure that you're kind of exporting your functions that you need to, or whatever other things you need to expose. So it's kind of called the revealing module pattern as well, because you're kind of starting to reveal some stuff from a module. But we'll get into that just now. Let me just add here that variables are scoped to the execution context. And that functions have their own execution context. So variables defined in them aren't exposed outside.